The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka remains one of World War II's most iconic aircraft. Its distinctive inverted gull wings and ear-piercing siren terrorized soldiers across Europe. But here's what most people don't know. Allied forces had radically different opinions about this dive bomber depending on when and where they faced it. From absolute terror to outright dismissal, the Stuka's reputation swung wildly throughout the war. The truth involves devastating losses, tactical blunders, and one particular battle that When the Stuka first appeared over Poland in September 1939, nothing had prepared Allied observers for its psychological impact. The Jericho trumpet sirens, specifically designed wind-driven devices mounted on the landing gear, produced a screaming wail that could be heard from miles away. Polish soldiers reported overwhelming panic as these predatory aircraft dove nearly vertically toward their positions. French liaison officers documenting the Polish campaign noted something disturbing in their reports. The Stuka didn't just destroy targets, it shattered morale. Troops would abandon perfectly defensible positions simply hearing the sirens approach. The psychological effect multiplied the actual destructive capacity by orders of magnitude. One French intelligence report stated that a single Stuka squadron created panic disproportionate to its actual bomb load. The blitzkrieg through France in May 1940 reinforced these terrifying first impressions. British Expeditionary Force soldiers described the experience as facing mechanical birds of prey. The aircraft would climb to altitude, roll inverted, then plunge at targets with horrifying precision. The combination of the screaming siren, the aircraft's distinctive silhouette, and the accuracy of its attacks created a weapon of terror unlike anything previously encountered. French ground commanders initially believed the Stuka possessed almost supernatural accuracy. Early reports credited it with pinpoint precision against individual vehicles and small targets. British officers observed that French troops, already demoralized by rapid German advances, would scatter at the mere sound of approaching aircraft engines, even before identifying them as Stukas. What Allied intelligence didn't yet understand was a critical vulnerability that RAF pilots were about to exploit devastatingly. But this discovery would come at a terrible cost and completely transform how every Allied force viewed this infamous dive bomber. August 13, 1940, marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's systematic assault on Britain. The Stuka squadrons that had terrorized continental Europe were deployed with confidence. What happened next shattered the aircraft's invincible reputation forever. RAF Fighter Command pilots immediately recognized what German planners had overlooked. The Ju-87's maximum speed of just 255 miles per hour made it pathetically slow compared to Hurricanes and Spitfires. After completing its dive and pulling up, the Stuka became a lumbering target. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson described engaging Stukas as almost unsporting, like shooting ducks in a gallery. On August 18th, during attacks on RAF Thorney Island and Ford airfields, Stuka losses became catastrophic. Number: 43 Squadron alone destroyed 9 Ju-87s in minutes. The aircraft's single rear-facing machine gun proved utterly inadequate against multiple attacking fighters. German rear gunners, already struggling with G-forces from the dive-bombing run, couldn't effectively defend against high-speed, slashing attacks. Squadron leader Peter Townsend wrote in his combat report that the Stuka turned like a brick and had all the defensive capability of a training aircraft. British pilots discovered they could attack from below and behind, where the rear gunner had limited traverse and the Stuka couldn't maneuver away. The fixed landing gear, while useful for dive-bombing accuracy, created additional drag that further hampered performance. By mid-August, Stuka losses exceeded 20% per mission over Britain. Luftwaffe commanders withdrew them from operations against British targets after just 2 weeks. RAF intelligence assessments shifted dramatically. One Air Ministry report coldly stated, "The Ju-87 is effective only in absence of fighter opposition." The terror weapon had been exposed as fundamentally flawed. Yet, in North Africa, a completely different story was unfolding, one that would force Allied commanders to reconsider everything they thought they'd learned about this aircraft. The Western Desert presented conditions radically different from the skies over Britain. Here, the Stuka found new life, and Allied opinions shifted yet again. British forces in North Africa during 1941 faced a resurgent threat they thought they'd already defeated. The desert environment played to the Stuka's strengths in unexpected ways. The vast open terrain meant dispersed formations and limited cover. Dive bombing accuracy mattered more when targets couldn't hide in forests or urban areas. RAF fighter coverage remained spotty across the enormous operational area, giving Stukas the one thing they absolutely required: time to attack without immediate fighter interception. Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling, founder of the SAS, documented Stuka attacks on long-range desert group patrols. He noted their ability to find and strike even small camouflaged vehicle formations with disturbing consistency. British tank crews reported that Stukas could exploit armor vulnerabilities by striking top surfaces, something nearly impossible for ground-based anti-tank weapons. Oberst Hans Ulrich Rudel's unit demonstrated devastating effectiveness against British armor at Gazala and Tobruk. British after-action reports grudgingly acknowledged that well-coordinated Stuka attacks could paralyze armored advances. One 7th Armored Division report stated, "When operating with proper fighter cover, the Ju-87 remains a formidable precision weapon against armored formations." The RAF adapted by developing specific counter-tactics. Hurricane squadrons practiced high-speed interception runs specifically designed to catch Stukas during their vulnerable pull-up phase. Anti-aircraft regiments trained to concentrate fire during the predictable dive pattern. British intelligence emphasized that the Stuka threat was manageable, but required constant fighter vigilance. By late 1942, Allied forces had developed effective countermeasures, but they'd learned a crucial lesson: dismiss the Stuka at your peril. The aircraft wasn't obsolete, it was specialized. However, what was happening simultaneously on the Eastern Front would reveal the most paradoxical chapter in the Stuka's combat history. While Western Allied forces had largely solved the Stuka problem, Soviet forces faced an entirely different reality. Between 1941 and 1945, the Ju-87 achieved its most devastating success on the Eastern Front, a fact that both puzzled and concerned British and American intelligence analysts. Hans Ulrich Rudel personally destroyed 519 Soviet tanks, flying exclusively Stukas. This single statistic baffled Allied air warfare experts. How could an aircraft deemed obsolete by RAF standards achieve such extraordinary results? British liaison officers attached to Soviet units reported that Luftwaffe dive bombers operated with near impunity during certain periods, particularly 1941 to 1942. The answer lay in Soviet Air Force capabilities during the early war period. Stalin's purges had decimated experienced Soviet aviators. Early war Soviet fighters like the I-16 and I-153 were even slower than Stukas in some configurations. German pilots enjoyed qualitative superiority in training, tactics, and often equipment. American intelligence reports from 1942 noted that Soviet air defenses remained primitive compared to British integrated systems. Soviet ground forces developed a unique perspective on the Stuka threat. Red Army reports described the psychological impact as even more severe than French accounts from 1940. Soviet infantry, often lacking adequate anti-aircraft weapons, could only take cover and hope. The Stuka's precision against bunkers, artillery positions, and supply columns made it a devastating tactical weapon throughout the German advances. However, by 1943, the situation shifted dramatically. American Lend-Lease aircraft began arriving in quantity. Soviet pilots gained experience. New fighters like the Yak-9 and La-5 possessed performance advantages over the Ju-87. British intelligence observed that Stuka losses on the Eastern Front were high. Front began matching Battle of Britain rates. German commanders increasingly restricted operations to dawn and dusk when fighter opposition was reduced. What truly fascinated Allied analysts was the adaptation timeline. Soviet forces took nearly 3 years to develop the integrated defense that Britain achieved in weeks. This disparity revealed as much about defensive systems as it did about the Stuka itself. But how exactly did Allied forces systematically neutralize this threat? The answer involved innovation at every level. Allied forces didn't simply wait for the Stuka to become obsolete, they systematically developed countermeasures that transformed it from terror weapon to manageable threat. This tactical evolution reveals how military doctrine adapts under pressure. The RAF pioneered the fundamental approach, aggressive fighter interception during the vulnerable phases of dive bombing attacks. Fighter Command established standing patrols over likely target areas, particularly airfields and ports. Pilots learned to time attacks during the Stuka's pullout when it was slowest and most predictable. Squadron leader Douglas Bader's Duxford wing tactics specifically incorporated Stuka interception protocols. British pilots discovered that a single pass by a 4-plane section could break up an entire Stuka formation. Anti-aircraft tactics evolved with equal sophistication. British and American gunners learned to concentrate fire in predicted zones rather than tracking individual aircraft. The Stuka's 90-degree dive made its flight path mathematically predictable. Artillery units developed rapid deployment protocols to establish protective envelopes around critical targets. One British anti-aircraft manual from 1942 stated, "The Ju-87's attack pattern is its greatest tactical weakness. Predictability equals vulnerability." Ground forces developed specific response protocols. Instead of scattering, which increased casualties, troops learned to maintain formation and continue operating AA weapons throughout attacks. British armour commanders discovered that maintaining movement during Stuka attacks significantly reduced hit probability. The aircraft's bombardier needed stable targets for accuracy. American forces entering the war benefited from accumulated British experience. USAAF fighter squadrons received detailed briefings on Stuka vulnerabilities. P-40 and P-38 pilots found the Ju-87 even easier prey than RAF pilots had. By 1943, encountering Stukas without escort became almost routine for Allied fighters and almost always fatal for the German aircraft. Intelligence integration proved crucial. Allied reconnaissance learned to identify Stuka airfields and forward deployment areas. Preemptive strikes on Stuka bases became standard procedure during major operations. The aircraft's requirement for prepared forward airstrips made it vulnerable to strategic interdiction. By 1944, the Stuka had been relegated to night harassment missions and operations in sectors with absolute German air superiority, which barely existed. But what did Allied commanders ultimately conclude about this controversial aircraft? After Germany's surrender, Allied Air Force historians gained access to complete Luftwaffe records. What they discovered complicated the wartime narrative considerably. The Stuka's actual combat record revealed a weapon far more nuanced than either propaganda or combat reports suggested. British Air Historical Branch analysis determined that the Stuka achieved remarkable accuracy, approximately 10 times better than conventional level bombers in 1939 to 1940. Against point targets like bridges, bunkers, and ships, few aircraft matched its precision. The dive bombing technique, while making the aircraft vulnerable, delivered results that justified the tactical risk in specific circumstances. American Strategic Bombing Survey analysts noted something unexpected. The Stuka's psychological impact had measurable strategic effects. French and Polish collapse owed partly to disruption of command and control, something the Stuka excelled at. However, this effectiveness depended entirely on opponents lacking modern air defenses and integrated fighter control. RAF Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's post-war assessment was particularly illuminating. He acknowledged that had Britain faced the 1940 Luftwaffe assault without radar and organized fighter control, Stukas might have achieved devastating results. The aircraft wasn't fundamentally flawed, it was designed for a tactical environment that Allied innovation had systematically dismantled. Soviet military historians offered the most complex perspective. They acknowledged the Stuka's devastating early war impact, while noting that it exposed critical deficiencies in Soviet air defense doctrine. The aircraft became a catalyst for Soviet tactical aviation reforms that eventually produced one of the war's most effective ground attack air forces. The verdict Allied historians ultimately reached was surprisingly balanced. The Ju-87 was a highly specialized weapon optimized for tactical environments that ceased to exist after 1940 in Western Europe. Its continued effectiveness on the Eastern Front reflected Soviet defensive weaknesses rather than German aircraft superiority. In absence of fighter opposition, it remained formidable. Against modern integrated defenses, it became a liability. Perhaps most tellingly, no Allied nation attempted to develop a similar aircraft after observing the Stuka's combat record. Instead, they invested in fast, versatile fighter bombers like the Typhoon and Thunderbolt that could both defend themselves and strike ground targets. The Stuka's legacy was teaching the Allies what not to build. The Stuka's reputation reveals how wartime perception often diverges from technical reality. Allied forces experienced everything from terror to contempt facing this aircraft, depending on context and capability. What began as an overwhelming psychological weapon ended as a cautionary tale about tactical specialization. Understanding this evolution shows how modern warfare demands adaptability above all. Keep watching Vintage Planes for more untold stories from aviation history that challenge everything you thought you knew.